The morning Marv Schill walked into the Cass County grain elevator and found Dean Caldwell standing at the scale ticket window. Marv was wearing a new Carhartt jacket with the tags still creased in the collar. He had driven over from Beardstown in a pickup that still had the dealership, mud flaps on the rear wheels. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking across the concrete floor at the man he had been trying to convince of something for the better part of 30 years, and something shifted behind his eyes that Dean noticed and then looked away from. The way you look away from a man who is about to say something he has not said before. Dean was 69 years old that October of 2013. He had on a Carhartt jacket of his own, faded to the color of a winter wheat field, the right cuff repaired with a strip of electrical tape, where the lining had pulled loose sometime around 2006. His boots were the kind you could not buy new anymore, the leather so worked in that the creases had become permanent geography. He had 3 scale tickets in his left hand and a ballpoint pen behind his ear, and he was not in any hurry. Marv walked across the floor toward him. The scale ticket operator, a young man named Pete who had worked the window since the previous spring, pretended to sort a stack of papers. "Dean," Marv said. "Marv." There was a long pause. The grain dryer on the far end of the elevator was running, and the sound it made filled the silence the way water fills a boot. "I've been thinking," Marv said, "that I owe you something." Dean looked at him then, level and without hurry, the way a man looks at a field he has walked every April for 4 decades and knows the drainage patterns of by memory. He did not say anything. He waited. "I pushed you hard," Marv said. "Back in the early years, I told you the man who stayed put was going to be left behind." Dean folded the scale tickets once and put them in his chest pocket. "You did say that. I was wrong about the arithmetic." Dean nodded once, slowly. "He did not say you were right, or I told you so, or any of the things a man might say after 31 years of being told he was falling behind." He picked up his pen from behind his ear, uncapped it, and said, "You want to see the ledger, or you want to take my word for it? Let me tell you how a man gets to that moment. Let me tell you what 35 years of a single policy looks like when it finally stands up and accounts for itself. The policy had a birthday, and it was born in the last week of October 1978, on a Tuesday afternoon when Dean was 24 years old and had been farming the 80 acres his father passed to him for exactly 1 growing season. His father, Harold Caldwell, had worked that same ground since 1951 and kept it in corn and hay and a small rotation of oats. And when Harold's heart gave out in the spring of 1977, he left the 80 acres to Dean with a handwritten note in the deed envelope that said simply, "Own it or don't work it." Dean had been turning that sentence over in his head for 18 months when Carl Ness lost his field. Carl Ness farmed the quarter section north of Dean's 80, 160 rented acres he had worked under a cash rent agreement with the Decker estate out of Springfield for 11 years. Carl was a careful man, not careless, not a gambler, and he had put good crops on that ground every year he worked it. He had a John Deere 4020 that he kept painted, and a set of field cultivators he had bought used from a dealer in Havana. He had 3 children and a wife named Ruth, who taught school. What Carl did not have was a note at the bank that was his to control. The Decker estate settled in October 1978, and the executor, a Springfield lawyer named Alderman, who had never set foot on the property, sold the entire parcel to a grain trading company out of St. Louis for cash. The new owners gave Carl 30 days' notice with the corn still standing in the field. 3 days before harvest. The letter arrived on a Saturday. Dean was at Carl's kitchen table when Carl read it. He watched Carl set the letter down on the oilcloth and smooth it with his palm, the way you smooth something that has already been decided. Ruth was standing at the sink. Nobody said anything for a long time. Then Carl said, very quietly, "I got a crop in that field." The grain trading company allowed Carl to harvest the corn he had planted. They did not owe him the courtesy, but they gave it. And then Carl Ness hauled his equipment off that ground for the last time, and the land he had spent 11 years learning was somebody else's to farm by the following spring. Dean drove home that evening on the county road that ran past the north edge of the Ness ground, and he could see Carl's corn rows in the last light, standing straight and gold and belonging to a company in Missouri. He sat in his father's old International pickup for a few minutes at the end of his own lane and looked at his 80 acres in the dusk, and he made a decision that he never afterward revised, never renegotiated with himself, and never explained at length to anyone who did not ask. The policy was this: no person would farm his ground unless they owned a stake in it. He would expand only by buying, never by renting. He would not put his equipment, or his labor, or his knowledge onto someone else's acres for wages or cash rent. And no one, under any circumstances, would farm his own ground as a renter. The ground he held outright, and the ground he worked, he owned. That was the whole of it. He did not write it down anywhere that October. He did not need to. It was the kind of decision that writes itself into the posture of a man's daily life and stays there. For the first 3 years, the policy cost him nothing visible. He was farming 80 acres of corn and hay, running a second-cut alfalfa rotation that his father had developed over 20 years, and he was doing it in the black. Not comfortably in the black, not with money to spare, but without debt, which in 1978 was a condition that a surprising number of his neighbors no longer shared. The farm credit system had been generous through the late 1970s, and land values had climbed for a decade, and the logic of borrowed expansion felt, to a lot of operators in Cass County, like arithmetic rather than gambling. Borrow against the land, buy more land. Borrow against that, buy more land still. The numbers seemed to confirm themselves. Marv Schill was one of the people who explained those numbers to farmers. He was 29 years old in 1981, a loan officer at the Cass County office of the Farmers Home Administration, and he wore pressed khaki trousers to work in an office 30 yards from a field that had not been plowed since 1975. He was not a bad man. He believed what the numbers told him, and the numbers in 1981 told him that a young operator sitting on 80 unencumbered acres in prime central Illinois ground was leaving yield on the table. Dean came into the FMHA office in the spring of 1981 because the Hendersons, who owned 40 acres adjacent to his south fence line, had put their ground up for sale. He wanted to understand what a loan would look like. He sat down across from Marv and listened for 20 minutes while Marv explained the opportunity. You could buy the Henderson 40 and finance another 160 in cash rent on top of it, Marv said. He was leaning slightly forward over the desk, the way a man leans when he is certain he is giving a gift. Operating note at 12.5%, land note separate. You'd be farming 240 acres by fall. Dean looked at the papers Marv had set in front of him. He looked at them for a while without picking them up. What happens to the cash rent ground if the landlord sells? He said. Marv smiled slightly. You find new ground, or you renegotiate. That's how it works for everyone. I know how it works, Dean said. I watched Carl Ness last year. Marv sat back a little. Carl Ness was unlucky. Carl Ness was correct, Dean said. He just didn't own the ground. He bought the Henderson 40. He did not finance the cash rent. He came back to Marv's office in the fall of 1981 with a down payment of $11,000 that he had saved over 3 crop years, and he borrowed $22,000 for the remainder of the Henderson parcel at a fixed rate, and he paid it on schedule, and he did not touch the rented acres conversation again. Marv tried again in 1982 and in 1983 and once more in the spring of 1985, each time with a different configuration of numbers and a slightly different pitch. The interest rate had climbed to 12.5% on operating notes by 1982, which did not seem to discourage Marv's enthusiasm. In 1983, he told Dean that a man his age who was still farming 120 acres was going to be irrelevant inside of a decade. The word he used was irrelevant. Dean thanked him and drove home. He said irrelevant, Dean told Connie that night at the kitchen table, where she had the household ledger open and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. Connie had married Dean in 1979. She kept a green, hardbound ledger with red spine tape, bought at the hardware store in Virginia, Illinois, and she had been recording every farm transaction in it since the spring of their first year. Every bushel sold, every input purchased, every land payment made, every tax bill paid. She had neat handwriting and a gift for seeing a trend line before it announced itself. She looked up from the ledger. "Are you?" "What?" "Irrelevant." Dean considered this for a moment. "Not to the 80 cows that need hay." Connie wrote something in the ledger and turned the page. Ray Caldwell was 21 years old in 1981 and had been watching his older brother farm their father's ground since he was old enough to drive a tractor. Ray was not reckless, but he was ambitious in the way that young men in Illinois farm country often were in the early 1980s, which is to say he believed that more acres meant more income, and that more income justified more acres, and that a man who did not expand was a man who was standing still. He had married a woman named Linda in 1980, and they were renting a farmhouse north of Hartsville, and Ray was looking for a place to plant himself in the world. In the spring of 1986, Ray signed a cash rent agreement on 480 acres of ground spread across 3 landlord parcels in Cass County. Marv endorsed the operating note. The cash rent ran at $110 an acre, which Ray could service if corn held above $2.20 a bushel, and he kept his input costs managed. Ray was a good farmer, maybe a better natural farmer than Dean in terms of raw instinct for soil and weather, and his first 2 years on the rented ground were solid. Connie tracked both brothers' ledgers from the beginning of this arrangement. The household numbers for Dean's operation, and the numbers Ray shared with them at family dinners. By 1988, Dean owned 120 acres, free and clear, and had no operating debt. Ray was farming 480 rented acres with an operating note that fluctuated between $60,000 and $80,000 depending on the season, and he had not bought a single acre. The gap in visible prosperity ran the other direction entirely, and everyone in Cass County could see it. Ray had a new 7140 Alice Chalmers in the shed, red and large and substantial, and a grain wagon set that was the envy of the Hartsville Co-op. Dean was running a 1971 John Deere 4030 that he had bought from Carl Ness in 1980 for $6,000 and had been maintaining with the diligence of a man who could not afford to replace it. The 4030 was green and faded and left a thin line of blue smoke when you started it cold, and Dean had repacked the front axle bearings twice by 1989. It started every morning. That was what Dean said when people asked about it. It starts every morning. The 1990s were Ray's decade, in the way that decades have of favoring a particular kind of ambition. Corn prices held well enough, cash rent rates stayed manageable through the early part of the period, and Ray expanded twice more on rented ground, picking up a 200-acre parcel from the Morton family in 1992 and another 80 acres from an estate sale in 1997. By 1998, Ray was farming 680 rented acres and had a reputation in Cass County as a serious operator. He drove a pickup with leather seats. Linda drove a new Suburban. Their two boys played travel baseball. The Hartsville Co-op on a Saturday morning in summer was a kind of informal tribunal of county opinion, and at that tribunal Ray Caldwell was considered a success. Dean had bought 40 more owned acres in 1991, a parcel that came available when the Sutter heirs dissolved their father's estate, and another 40 in 1995 from a retiring neighbor named Bob Hicks, who had farmed it since 1958. That put Dean at 200 acres owned, no debt, and still running the 4030 and a 1978 combine that he and a friend named Gerald Ash kept functional through mutual stubbornness and a good relationship with the parts counter at the Havana equipment dealer. It was at the Hartsville Co-op in the summer of 1994 that Marv Schill made the remark that got repeated around the county for a while afterward. Dean had come in to pick up a box of hydraulic fittings, and Marv was at the counter buying a coffee, and he saw Dean's faded jacket and the 4030 through the window, and said to the three men standing with him, not quietly enough, "Dean Caldwell's been farming since 1977, and I think that tractor's older than he is." The men at the counter laughed. One of them, a crop insurance agent named Donaldson, said something about being dirt rich in the particular way that phrase was used in that county, meaning a man who owned ground but had nothing else to show for himself. Dean had heard it. He paid for his fittings and carried them to the truck without comment. He was not wounded exactly. He had made a decision in 1978 that required him to look a certain way for a certain number of years, and he had understood this from the beginning. What he felt, driving home on the county road with the box of fittings on the seat beside him, was a quiet, arithmetical certainty, the way you feel when you have checked a column of figures twice and know the total is correct. He mentioned it to Connie that evening. She was at the kitchen table with the green ledger. "Donaldson called you dirt rich," she said. "Marv made a remark about the tractor." Connie looked at the ledger and then back at him. "The tractor starts every morning." "It does," Dean said. "Write it down somewhere," she said, "so we have it when it matters." She said this dryly, not as a comfort, and Dean smiled, and neither of them said anything else about it. By 2003, Connie had filled 2 green ledgers and started a third. Dean owned 320 acres, free and clear, having bought 2 additional parcels in 1999 and 2001, one of them a wet ground 80 that he had tiled himself over 2 winters with Gerald Ash and a used ditch witch. The tiling project had taken 240 hours of work and cost him $11,000 in materials, and he had done it instead of buying a new tractor, which meant the 4030 went into its 32nd year of service on Dean's farm with a new set of rear tires and a rebuilt injection pump. 320 acres owned. No operating debt, no land debt. The farm produced corn, soybeans in rotation, and a second-cut hay operation on the bottom ground that Dean had run continuously since his father's time. Ray's ledger, as best Connie could track it from family conversation and the casual arithmetic of dinners and phone calls, showed operating debt of approximately $340,000 in the spring of 2003. The debt was a combination of deferred input financing, an operating line that had grown through 2 lean corn years, and a set of equipment loans on machinery that Ray had needed to cover the acreage he was farming. He was still farming 680 rented acres and still making it work, crop year by crop year, in the way a skilled operator can make a difficult position work if the weather cooperates and the prices hold. The prices sagged in the late summer of 2003. Corn futures dropped below $2.20 a bushel through August, and Dean sat at the kitchen table one evening and looked at his bin inventory and the cash price board and felt, for the first time in years, a quiet uncertainty. He had 280 acres of corn that year, and the harvest looked strong, but the price was soft enough that the bin spread. The difference between selling now and holding into winter was going to matter to his annual surplus. He held the pen over the column in the green ledger and did not write anything for a long time. If you want to know what doubt sounds like in a man who rarely voices it, it sounds like a pen not moving. He sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, and then Connie came in from the other room and looked at the board and looked at the ledger and said, "We've been here before. The price is soft." "The ground isn't," she said. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the counter and did not elaborate, because she did not need to. Dean put the pen down and went to bed. In the morning, he checked the bin temperatures, noted that the corn was dry and holding, and decided to store through October and watch the board. By November, the price had recovered to $2.40, and he sold on a Thursday afternoon and wrote the number in the ledger without any additional feeling about it. That was the one moment of private uncertainty. He set it down and did not pick it up again. The credit contraction that began in 2008 arrived in Cass County, the way structural things always arrive in farm country, which is not all at once, but steadily, one landlord decision at a time. Lenders who had been generous through the expansion years grew cautious. Landlords who had been holding ground for rental income discovered that their heirs or their accountants or their estate lawyers were recommending liquidation. 3 of the parcels that Ray had been cash renting for years went on the market between the fall of 2008 and the spring of 2009. 2 of them sold to a farmland investment fund out of Indianapolis that took over the rental agreements and then, 6 months after the purchase, declined to renew them, preferring to farm the ground under a custom farming arrangement with a larger operator. Ray lost 440 rented acres in 14 months. He went from farming 680 acres to farming 240, all of them rented, none of them his, and none of the $340,000 he had borrowed across 20 years of operation had purchased a single square foot of ground he still controlled. He called Dean on a Sunday evening in March of 2009. Dean was in the shop doing maintenance on the 4030, which had developed a coolant leak at the lower radiator hose fitting. He had the radio on. "I'm down to 240, Ray said. "All rented." Dean waited a moment. "You going to be all right?" "I don't know." A pause. "Linda's folks are helping with the cash flow." Dean did not say anything about the years he had tried to explain the arithmetic to his brother. He did not remind Ray of Carl Ness or of any conversation they had ever had about what it meant to build your operation on ground you did not own. He said, "Come over this week if you want to look at numbers together." Ray came over on a Wednesday. He and Dean and Connie sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger open and Ray's notes spread beside it, and they worked through the position for 3 hours, and by the end of the evening, they had a plan for Ray to service his debt on the reduced acreage without defaulting. It was a narrow plan, and it required Ray to sell his largest tractor, a 2004 Case 1H that he had bought on a 5-year note in 2006, and to take on some custom work for neighbors. It was not a comfortable plan, but it held. If you want to know what discipline costs a man in the years before it pays him back, one version of the answer is sitting across a kitchen table from your brother while he sells the machine he loves and rearranges the pieces of a farming life that cannot be rebuilt to what it was. The drought year of 2012 did not spare Cass County. Central Illinois corn that had projected at 190 bushels per acre in a June that looked like a good year came in at somewhere between 65 and 75 bushels on most ground by September, a reduction of roughly 60% from projected yield on the farms that had normal expectations. The heat arrived in July and did not relent for 6 weeks, and the corn that had been knee-high and dark green by the 4th of July was brown and curled at the leaf edges by the last week of the month. Dean walked his rows on a Tuesday morning in the second week of August, and stood for a while at the edge of the field and looked at the color of the crop and understood that the season was over in the way it sometimes is, not with drama, but with the plain arithmetic of not enough rain at the wrong time. His 320 owned acres yielded an average of 71 bushels per acre that fall, well below his 10-year average of 163. It was a hard year financially, and he knew it going in. What he did not carry into that year was an operating note at a bank that would be due regardless of what the sky did, because he had not borrowed to plant. His input costs were paid from the previous year's grain sale surplus. His land payment was zero because there was no land payment. The year would hurt his annual surplus and delay a planned bin expansion, but it would not threaten his ownership of a single acre. Across the county, the drought found the weak points in other operations, the way water finds the low spots in a field. Operators who had financed expansion through the land boom years of 2006 through 2011 and were carrying large operating notes alongside their land debt came to their lenders in the fall of 2012 with yield reports that did not support the repayment schedules they had signed. Several of them could not bridge the gap. By November of 2012, there were 4 foreclosure proceedings recorded in the Cass County Courthouse, and by the following spring, there would be 7 more. Marv Schill was no longer a loan officer. He had left the FMHA in the early 1990s and built a land brokerage operation in Beardstown. And through the 2000s, he had done well matching buyers to sellers in a rising market. He had also, in the years after 2005, encouraged a number of his land-buying clients to finance their purchases aggressively, arguing that land values in central Illinois would continue to appreciate and that carrying costs would be covered by rental income. He had not been wrong in the short term. In the short term, the land had appreciated. What the short term did not include was the 2012 drought and the credit tightening that followed, and several of his clients, carrying notes at 70 and 80% of inflated land values, found themselves unable to service the debt when their rented acres' income dropped with the drought year and their refinancing options narrowed. In the October of 2012, Marv attended a foreclosure auction for a farm he had brokered the sale of in 2008. He stood in the back of the auction barn north of Beardstown and watched the property sell at a price that did not cover the note, and the man who had bought it on Marv's recommendation, a grain farmer named Voss, who had been in the county 30 years, sat in the third row and did not bid because there was nothing left for him to bid with. Marv watched Voss collect his hat from the seat beside him and walk out the back of the barn with his hands in his pockets, and Marv stood there a moment longer than he needed to. He did not go to Dean immediately. He drove home from that auction and spent the better part of a year running numbers on the difference between what he had told people to do and what Dean Caldwell had spent 30 years refusing to do. He ran the numbers because he was a man who believed in numbers, and the numbers, after 2012, were not gentle with his assumptions. He found Dean at the Cass County grain elevator on a Thursday morning in early October of 2013. The scale line was backed up slightly, 3 trucks waiting, and Dean was at the window with his tickets. Marv had driven over from Beardstown in the new pickup with the dealership mud flaps, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he crossed the concrete floor. What happened next was not dramatic in any way that would play well at a distance, because the people involved were not dramatic people. Marv said he owed Dean something. He said he had pushed him wrong. He said he had been wrong about the arithmetic, and he named it directly, which cost him something, and Dean could see it cost him, which is why he did not add to the cost. "You want to see the ledger," Dean said, "or you want to take my word for it?" Marv looked at him. "What does the ledger say?" Dean reached into the chest pocket of the faded jacket and pulled out the scale tickets and a folded piece of paper beside them, which was not a ledger but a summary in Connie's handwriting that she had prepared the previous evening when Dean had mentioned he expected to see Marv at the elevator. 320 acres, owned outright. Current market value at 2013 prices, approximately $7,400 per acre on the open market, which put the land value alone at just under $2.5 million. No land debt, no operating debt, grain bin capacity of 48,000 bushels owned. One combine, a 2001 model purchased, used in 2004, owned. Equipment line, owned. Farm account at the Hartsville Bank, positive. Marv read it. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he already knows the conclusion of but needs to see in figures before it becomes entirely real. 320, he said. 320, Dean said. All of it owned. Since 2001, Dean said. The last 40 I paid off in September of that year. Marv folded the paper and handed it back. He looked at the scale window for a moment, and then back at Dean. Pete, the ticket operator, was very busy sorting papers. "I told you in 1983 you were going to be irrelevant," Marv said. "You did." "I owe you more than I said." Dean put the paper back in his chest pocket. "The policy worked," he said. "That's all it was. My dad wrote me a note that said own it or don't work it. I didn't do anything else." He paused, and then he said, which was as close to an explanation as Marv was going to get. "Carl Ness was a better farmer than me. He just didn't own the ground." Marv nodded. He bought a coffee from the machine in the corner of the elevator office, and he and Dean stood there for a few minutes and talked about the drought year and the foreclosure numbers and the direction of land prices. And then Marv got in his new truck and drove back to Beardstown, and Dean got in his truck, which was a 1999 model with 280,000 miles on it and a cracked dashboard, and drove home. The conversation he and Connie had that evening at the kitchen table was brief. She had the green ledger open, the third one, and she wrote a small note in the margin beside the October entries that said, "Marv Schill at elevator." That was all she wrote. Dean did not ask what it meant, and she did not explain it, because they had been talking to each other across that table for 34 years, and some things did not need explaining. There was one more piece of business that the policy required. Tate Harmon was 28 years old in the spring of 2014 and had been farming rented ground in Cass County for 5 years, cash renting 160 acres from 2 separate landlords and running a careful, debt-modest operation on it. He was the kind of young farmer who read his soil tests before the seed rep told him to and kept a maintenance log on his equipment. And Dean had watched him operate for the better part of those 5 years, with the quiet attention a man pays to someone who is doing the work correctly. In February of 2014, one of Tate's landlords, an elderly woman named Clara Finch, who had been holding her family ground since her husband passed in 2001, died without a will, and her 4 children, none of whom farmed, agreed within 3 weeks that they wanted the ground liquidated. The parcel was 80 acres, and at 2014 market prices it was going to sell for somewhere between $600,000 and $624,000, which was not a price a 28-year-old farmer with no family capital behind him was going to match. Tate lost the ground. He rented 40 acres of replacement ground from a neighbor, but the replacement was poorer quality soil and a less favorable arrangement, and anyone watching him knew the corner he was in. Dean drove over to Tate's place on a Saturday morning in April of 2014. Tate was in the shop sharpening disc blades. Dean got out of the truck and stood in the doorway for a moment, and Tate looked up and shut the grinder off. "I want to talk to you about 40 acres, Dean said. He had the 40-acre parcel on the south end of his property in mind, the piece he had bought from the Sutter estate in 1991. It was good ground, tile-drained, with a county road on the south edge. It appraised at $3,200 per acre in 2003, when Dean had last had it formally valued. The current market in 2014 was running at $7,800 per acre for comparable ground in Cass County. Dean's terms were these. He would sell Tate the 40 acres on an installment land contract, 10 years, 0 interest, at the 2003 appraised value of $3,200 per acre, which worked out to $128,000 total. Annual payments of $12,800. No bank involved, no interest. A price that was less than half the market rate on the day of the sale. Tate stood in the doorway of his shop for a moment with the disc blade still in his hand and said, "Why?" It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. Dean looked at him. "Because you're farming it correctly," Dean said. "And because someone needs to own it who will be here in 30 years. He paused. "And because the policy works better if more people know about it." Tate asked him twice more in the following week if he was certain about the price. Dean told him both times that the price was the price, and the terms were the terms, and the only condition was that Tate had to own the ground or vacate it. No subletting, no absentee operation. The contract was signed at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in May of 2014, with Connie present and the green ledger open to a fresh page and Gerald Ash serving as witness, as he had served as witness at most of the significant transactions of Dean's adult life. After Tate and Gerald left, Connie made 2 cups of coffee, and they sat at the table, and she wrote the terms of the land contract into the ledger in her neat handwriting. And when she was done, she looked at what she had written for a moment and said, "Your dad would have done this." Dean thought about it. "Probably not the 0 interest part." "No," she said. "Probably not that." She closed the ledger and set it on the shelf above the table, where it had lived since 1979, in the spot between the County Extension Directory and a McCormick parts manual for an engine Dean no longer owned. The ledger's green cover had faded at the corners, and the red spine tape had been replaced twice, and it was thick enough that it did not close all the way flat anymore, the pages having absorbed 35 years of entries in Connie's handwriting and occasionally Dean's. Outside, the spring dark had come up over the east field. Dean sat at the table with his coffee going cool and the house quiet around him. And through the kitchen window he could see the lights of the Tate place 2 miles south. The yard light over the equipment shed, steady and yellow in the flat Illinois dark. The 40 acres between them was a line on the county plat that would have a new owner's name on it by the end of the month. The remaining 280 acres behind the house was the same ground Harold Caldwell had walked in 1951, the same ground Dean had inherited in 1977, carrying in its soil the drainage patterns and rotation history of more than 60 years of careful attention. The 4030 was parked in the shed, retired now to the status of a backup unit after Dean had bought the used combine in 2004 and a second tractor in 2011, but not scrapped, not sold, still with its set of rear tires from 1999, and the rebuilt injection pump and the blue line of smoke on a cold morning start. It started every morning. The policy had not changed since the Tuesday afternoon in October 1978 when Dean drove home, passed Carl Ness's corn rows in the last light, and made a decision at the end of his own lane. It had not needed changing. It had needed only consistency and patience, and the willingness to look a certain way for a certain number of years while the arithmetic ran its course. Connie picked up her coffee cup and turned it in her hands, looking at the window and the dark field beyond it. And she did not say anything else. And Dean did not say anything else. And the kitchen lamp lit the table between them the same way it had every evening since the spring of 1979. The ground was still there. It had always been the whole argument.